It was a peculiar thing, that bell, the one that tolled just after Vespers at St. Fridswide's. A minor delay, perhaps 5 seconds at most, yet in that small fracture of time there lay the quiet sense of something out of joint. I had stopped there that evening for no reason beyond habit, the kind that afflicts men who no longer pretend their walks have purpose. The sky was turning from grey to ink, and the smell of damp stone seemed sharper than usual, as if the old college had drawn a deep breath. I had been at the turf earlier, nursing a whiskey I didn't need, watching the mist creep over Holywell Street. A porter I half knew mentioned that one of the fellows, Lionel Crane, hadn't been seen since yesterday's evensong. I muttered that academics often vanish into their own vanity, but even as I said it, I felt the faint prickle of curiosity, that involuntary stirring that begins every case worth remembering. When I reached the gate, the porter stood in the lodge under a weak electric light. His cap sat askew, his eyes re-rimmed from years of service and sherry. He asked if I'd heard the news. I told him I rarely heard anything worth the word. He shrugged and said Dr. Crane hadn't signed out, his bicycle still by the Cloister. I glanced at the ledger on the counter, a page of neat names and times, and noticed that Crane's entry from the previous night had been scratched out, not crossed cleanly, but rubbed to a grey blur, as though someone had tried to unwrite his existence. Rain began to fall then, in the hesitant way it often does over Oxford, a kind of atmospheric indecision. I took shelter beneath the archway, listening to the bell begin its late tolling again. The sound travelled unevenly across the quadrangle, caught in the cloister, delayed, then returned upon itself. It was not dissonant exactly, but wrong in the way a memory sometimes is familiar, yet fractionally displaced. I thought of Crane, the dry, fastidious man who lectured on medieval Latin as if it were a personal penance. I'd attended one of his talks years earlier. He'd spoken about monastic confessions, about how the echoes of voices in stone chambers could turn human guilt into music. The idea had stayed with me more than his scholarship had. Lewis would later tell me I seemed distracted that night, though I doubt he noticed how much. I remember passing the porter again as I left. He said the dean had already called the police, but I was technically the police, so I let the matter rest in silence. I gave him a nod that might have meant anything. Back at my flat, I poured another whiskey and unfolded the Oxford Mail. There, between the council's parking proposals and a notice about a church fete, I saw the small paragraph university fellow missing. Last seen leaving evensong, presumed on retreat. The brevity of it irritated me. The world has a way of summarizing a life before it's been lived. The room was cold, the radiator sulking as usual. I sat by the window, watching the drizzle form crooked rivers on the glass. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, that same bell was probably striking again, too late or too early, I couldn't tell. I thought of the erased ledger line, the untouched bicycle, the unfinished echo. It's strange what begins a case. Not the corpse, nor the confession, but a sound slightly mistimed, the kind that slips past logic and lands somewhere between intuition and superstition. I didn't know then that Dr. Crane was already dead. I only knew that Oxford, like a guilty conscience, had just whispered something under its breath, and I'd been foolish enough to hear it. I returned to St. Fridswide's the next morning, though I could not have said why. Some cases begin before anyone calls them such. The rain had spent itself overnight, leaving the stones washed to a pale, sorrowful gleam. The porter greeted me with the kind of caution reserved for men who arrive too early and know too much. He told me the dean would see me in her rooms, and that I was to wipe my shoes before entering. It was the tone that always reminded me I had left formal education too soon. Inside, the air was thick with furniture polish and old conviction. The dean was one of those women whose calmness could slice a man in half. She spoke in that level voice that makes every question sound like judgment. Dr. Crane, she said, was a valued fellow, though prone to moments of peculiar zeal. His work on penitential manuscripts had lately become something of an obsession. I asked whether obsession was unusual at St. Frideswide's. She smiled without warmth and said that here, obsession was considered the highest form of scholarship. Lewis stood by the mantelpiece, polite and faintly uncomfortable. He had taken notes already, though I suspected he had no idea what any of it meant. The dean mentioned that Crane had quarrelled recently with Dr. Amelia Vale, the college's classicist. A small matter of authorship, she said, which in academic circles is often a large one. I asked if they were close. She hesitated, then replied that intimacy in Oxford was rarely visible to the naked eye. We were shown to Crane's staircase by a junior fellow with the distracted face of perpetual intellect. The corridors smelled faintly of beeswax and gilt. From a nearby window, I caught sight of the cloister, long, grey, half-lit. Two figures crossed it silently, one in academic gown, the other in the rough habit of a lay brother. They seemed to glide rather than walk, as if sound were forbidden within those stones. I asked the fellow who they were. He said Brother Julian kept the archives, and that silence was his chosen form of speech. Crane's rooms were locked. Lewis fetched the porter with a set of keys that jingled too loudly. The moment the door opened, I felt the stale stillness of a life abruptly paused. Books lined the shelves in military order, the desk polished to a fault. The bed was made, the curtains drawn. Only the faint scent of whiskey lingered, that and the suggestion of solitude that had lasted too long. On the table lay a single sheet of paper bearing a crossword puzzle clipped from the Times. I leaned closer. Most of it was filled, save for a cluster in the upper corner. The clue read, "Sin confessed in delay," 5 letters. The answer written there was guilt, though the number was wrong. I noted it without comment. Lewis poked about the small sitting room, finding nothing amiss. The waste-paper basket held a torn envelope and an empty matchbox from the Randolph. I asked him to keep both. On the mantelpiece sat a photograph of Crane in younger days, beside a woman whose face had been cut out neatly, as if to remove only the memory, not the event. Down in the chapel, we met Brother Julian. His eyes were too kind for the world he lived in. He said he had last seen Crane 2 evenings ago, leaving Evensong alone. I asked whether anyone followed. He thought not, but the phrasing carried doubt. He spoke softly, almost to himself, of the college rule of silence after Compline. "It is meant for peace," he said, "but it hides everything equally, prayer and deceit alike." When I stepped back into the quadrangle, the bell struck the hour on time this once, though the echo still came late. The sound seemed to chase itself through the cloister and die beneath the chapel roof. Lewis asked if I thought Crane had taken his own life. I told him I disliked conclusions without evidence. He said it looked like nothing had happened. I told him most crimes begin that way. It was then, glancing at the ledger of borrowed keys in the porter's lodge, that I noticed the faint indentation beside Crane's name, a second, lighter hand tracing over his entry. Someone had borrowed his access and then tried to put it back, as carefully as a thief returning confession to its drawer. I said nothing, but I knew already the circle had closed around itself, and that the whisper I had heard last night had not been the wind at all. The next morning came with a kind of reluctant brightness, that pallid Oxford sunlight, which never quite decides whether to bless or accuse. Lewis and I were given the key to Crane's rooms, and as the lock turned, the sound struck me as too loud for a college that prided itself on silence. There is a tone to absence if one listens long enough. Crane's rooms had it. He had lived simply, perhaps too simply for a man who spent his life among manuscripts. A single chair by the fire, a bed neatly made, the faint trace of candle smoke clinging to the curtains. Nothing was out of place, which, to my mind, is itself a kind of disorder. Order requires a hand to maintain it, and no such hand had touched this room since the man who owned it vanished. Lewis remarked that everything looked untouched. I told him to look again. There was a whiskey glass on the desk and a small ring of dust beneath it, meaning it had sat there for more than a day. Yet the bottle beside it was half empty, its cork freshly replaced. A contradiction, subtle but enough. Someone had been here, tidying what should not have been tidied. On the desk lay the crossword again, still open from 2 nights before. The clues were done in Crane's meticulous hand. Save one, the word penitent had been crossed out and replaced with guilty. The difference seemed trivial, yet I felt its weight. One word suggests remorse, the other, admission. I had learned long ago that guilt and penitence rarely share the same room. I found no diary, no letters. A small brass key sat in a dish, tarnished, unused. Lewis checked the wardrobe. Only 2 suits, identical in their dullness. On the top shelf, an umbrella with a faint tear in the silk. Beside it, a single shoe print on the wooden floor, half a print rather, pressed into a layer of dust disturbed just once. Whoever had been here had stood very still, just there, long enough to leave a trace of waiting. Outside, through the open window, the sound of the cloister drifted upward, faint footsteps echoing irregularly against the stones. I moved closer and looked down. A figure in clerical black crossed the courtyard, head bowed. Brother Julian again, gliding beneath the arches. No one else. I asked Lewis whether he heard the second set of steps. He frowned and said he hadn't. I said nothing. Sometimes sound lies. We spoke later with the porter. He remembered that on the night of Crane's disappearance, the rain had been heavy. He'd heard voices near the chapel, 2 men, one sharp, one pleading. He couldn't tell who they were, only that the argument ended abruptly. I asked if he'd heard footsteps leaving afterward. He hesitated. Said he thought he had, though now he couldn't swear which direction they'd gone. The echo, he said, confuses a man in that cloister. It's never clear whether the sound is coming toward you or away. In the library, I found the borrowing ledger rows of careful handwriting. Crane's last entry was dated 3 days before his death. The title, Confessions Monastic. I traced the line with my finger and felt where the ink had been pressed harder than usual, as if the act of signing his name had cost him something. The librarian, a severe woman with a habit of blinking only when spoken to, said the volume had since gone missing. A small matter, she called it. I disagreed. In Oxford, very little ever goes missing without reason. When we left the college, Lewis remarked that the rain had cleaned everything, as though the world were trying to start fresh. I told him it was merely rearranging its guilt. He gave me one of his glances, the kind that asks without words if I ever stopped thinking in riddles. I almost said yes, but the truth is, I never do. That night, back in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and set the crossword before me once more. The clue that Crane had altered still troubled me. Sin confessed in delay. The answer he'd written guilty didn't quite fit. Not numerically, not spiritually. 5 letters, yes, but incomplete. I tried another later. It matched neither meaning nor meter, yet something about it felt right. Guilt delayed is confession denied. I circled it, then left it there. Some clues, I've learned, are not meant to be solved too soon. Outside, rain began again, soft and irregular. Somewhere, faintly, I thought I heard footsteps crossing a courtyard. 2 sets, uneven, one heavier than the other, and then silence, as if the stones themselves had chosen to forget. It was Lewis who first mentioned her name. Dr. Amelia Vale, classics, St. Frida's Wides. A reputation for brilliance sharpened by something less definable, perhaps cruelty, though no one ever dared call it that aloud. I recalled her faintly from some lecture reception years earlier, standing apart, glass in hand, watching the room with the air of someone reading a text everyone else was merely quoting. I'd thought her beautiful then, in that precise, self-punishing way some women of intellect have when they realize the world will never quite forgive them for it. Her rooms were in the south range, overlooking the cloister. When I called, the rain had returned, soft and intrusive, misting the old glass until the quadrangle seemed like a half-remembered dream. She let me in without preamble, gesturing to a chair that looked too delicate to bear my weight. The scent of paper and lilies filled the air, an oddly intimate combination. She spoke before I did, her voice as clipped as her handwriting. "You've come about Lionel." I nodded. She smiled faintly. "Everyone comes about Lionel, sooner or later." Then, as if correcting herself, Dr. Crane. "We were colleagues." That word hung there, polished, deliberate. I asked how well she had known him. She said they had shared an affection for dead languages, though in her case the affection was tempered by survival. I told her that Crane's last notes suggested a disagreement between them as a matter of translation. She shrugged, and in that movement there was something like disdain. "He accused me," she said, "of mistranslating Horace." He was wrong, of course. She turned toward the window. "But I imagine you didn't come here to discuss philology." There was a pause, not silence, but the kind of quiet that suggests an unplayed note in music. I watched her fingers trace the rim of her glass. The motion was too controlled to be nervous. She was performing composure, which meant she feared something. I asked whether she had seen Crane the night he disappeared. She said no, though she had received a note from him that morning. It concerned a manuscript, something he wished to discuss in private. She had declined the invitation. I noticed the open book on her desk, Odes of Horace, bound in worn leather. A pencil mark rested against a familiar line. "Mutato nomine de te fabula narratur." Change the name and the story is told of you. She saw me glance at it and said softly that Crane had quoted that line to her once, when he believed her scholarship a form of confession. Then, with a tone I could not quite name, she added that all scholars confess eventually through what they choose to publish, or what they choose to omit. Lewis, waiting outside in the corridor, knocked twice to remind me of time. I asked her, almost idly, whether she believed Crane had enemies. She smiled again, though not at me. "Only admirers," she said, "and they are always worse." I asked whether she had read his recent paper on monastic secrecy. She said she had skimmed it, then paused. He had the gift of implying sin without naming it, a dangerous gift in Oxford. When I rose to leave, she stopped me. "You think I'm lying, don't you?" I said that everyone lies to a small degree, even those telling the truth. She seemed to consider that, then asked, quietly, whether Lionel had suffered. I told her we didn't yet know. Her eyes flickered once, the way a candle might before surrendering to the draught. Outside, the cloister lay empty, the flagstones shining with new rain. I paused by the chapel arch and looked back toward her window. A faint light still burned, though the figure within had vanished. Somewhere behind me, a door closed softly. Lewis said she was cold, that sort of woman. I told him she was frightened. He asked what. I said of being wrong in Latin, in life, in the stories she's written herself into. He said that was an odd thing to fear. I told him that for some people, it's the only thing. Later, back in my office, I took out Crane's crossword again. The clue that had once read sin confessed in delay now seemed to echo her phrase, implying sin without naming it. Beneath the light, the penciled answer guilty appeared darker than before, as though someone had pressed harder over it. I wondered whether I'd seen that same pressure in her eyes. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began to toll the hour this time on time, but still slightly uneven. I thought of her translating Horace in that room, changing names, altering meanings, preserving her place within the grammar of concealment. I thought of Crane's missing manuscript and the erased photograph in his rooms. Perhaps all scholars are indeed confessors, only some prefer to whisper their sins in another tongue. The library at St. Frideswide's had always unnerved me, not by grandeur, but by its indifference to time. The air was thick with the slow decay of vellum and oak. Each breath seemed filtered through centuries of someone else's thinking. Lewis walked ahead of me, his footsteps hushed by the worn carpet, his discomfort almost audible. He had never understood how books could make a man uneasy. I envied that innocence. We were met by Mrs. Phelps, the college librarian, a small woman of immense stillness whose spectacles magnified her eyes into pale moons. She spoke with the dry assurance of one who has ruled a kingdom of dust for too long. Dr. Crane, she said, had recently consulted the archives for a manuscript, Confessiones monasticae. She pronounced the Latin as though summoning a ghost. It was an obscure medieval collection, a miscellany of private devotions written by unnamed monks, one of those texts that promised revelation and delivered only shadows. She led us to the locked cabinet where it was kept. The door opened reluctantly, as if resenting the light. Inside were rows of leather-bound spines, each labeled by a fading hand. The space where Confessiones should have stood was empty. Mrs. Phelps frowned, a precise movement like the turning of a page. She was certain the book had been returned. I asked when. She said 2 nights ago. Crane himself had signed it back. I examined the ledger, his signature, the last on the page, written with more force than necessary. Yet there was something odd in the ink, a faint smudge along the tail of the E, as though the pen had trembled. It was a small thing, but the smallest things are usually what remain. I asked to see the quill he had used. She said they were kept in a communal stand. I could have smiled at that, even among scholars. Evidence is shared until it disappears. Lewis asked what the manuscript contained. Mrs. Phelps hesitated. Confessions, she said finally, but not in the usual sense. These were private penitential statements, coded through allegory and wordplay, the sins of those who wrote them buried in Latin riddles. Some said the compiler had gone mad decoding them. She said this with a faint note of admiration. I thanked her and turned to leave, but paused at the cabinet once more. The shelf beneath the missing manuscript bore a light layer of dust, except for a clean line where something rectangular had rested briefly recently, and not long enough to belong. Crane had returned something, yes, but not what he took. Outside, the cloister was slick with rain again. The sound of the bell drifted faintly, that same delayed echo I'd come to expect. Lewis said the librarian gave him the creeps. I told him Oxford thrived on the cultivation of unease. He asked what Crane wanted with the manuscript. I said perhaps a confession. He frowned, but what did he have to confess? I told him we were still finding the language. Later that evening, back at the station, I spread Crane's papers across my desk. The crossword sat among them, the word guilty circled twice in pencil. The ink on his library signature matched the shade of that same pencil, a strange, deliberate substitution. Ink where there should have been graphite. Graphite where there should have been ink. A trade of mediums. I thought again of that smudge in his signature, the faint drag of hesitation. It wasn't a tremor, it was a correction. Someone had copied his handwriting. Lewis returned with tea, muttering about the weather. He said he'd checked with the porter. No one had entered the library after closing, at least not officially. I told him officially was a meaningless word in Oxford. He asked whether I thought Dr. Vale might be involved. I said she was too clever to steal in the ordinary sense, but perhaps not in the academic one. As he left, I poured a measure of whiskey and studied the page again. Crane's handwriting across the crossword seemed to lean forward, eager, unfinished. I glanced at the Latin phrase scribbled in the margin of one of his notebooks, veritas per confessionem non invenitur. Truth is not found through confession. I sat there for a long while, hearing the faint hum of the rain against the window, the drip from the eaves. Somewhere in that rhythm I began to sense the shape of something not yet a pattern, just the ghost of one. A man reads a book of hidden sins, returns something in its place, and disappears beneath the weight of silence. Oxford had always been fond of parables, but this one felt uncomfortably personal. The bell of St. Fridswide's rang again, late as ever. I found myself counting the seconds between chime and echo. 6, then 7. Delay upon delay. I wondered if the sound, like guilt, was simply taking the long way back. The discovery came not with alarm, but inevitability, as though the college had merely uncovered what it had always known. A gardener, trimming ivy near the chapel well, found the body. The water had turned a dull green, reflecting nothing. When they pulled Crane out, his spectacles remained perched neatly on his nose. There was a stillness to him, an obedience even in death, that made the coroner's word suicide sound indecently efficient. Lewis waited until after the body was removed before speaking. He said the doctor thought drowning unlikely, that Crane's lungs were half empty. I said it was enough to have been half full. He didn't understand. Most people don't. The inquest was held that same afternoon in the senior common room, where the scent of polish and pipe smoke tried to conceal the faint odor of damp wool. The dean read the formalities with the precision of one performing absolution. The fellows murmured, nodded, and took tea. I watched them all, the intricate choreography of pity and self-preservation. Dr. Vale sat apart, her face a perfect essay in restraint. She did not look at me, nor at the empty chair reserved for Crane. The coroner suggested melancholy, perhaps overwork. The dean agreed, quietly relieved by the lack of contradiction. When asked about enemies, no one answered. When asked about faith, the silence lengthened. Oxford, I've found, is full of believers who no longer pray. Afterwards, Lewis and I remained in the chapel as the choir rehearsed. Their voices rose and fell through the high air like a tide of innocence ignorant of its own sound. The organ began softly, a long note stretching, trembling. Then I heard a single voice entering one beat too soon, then correcting itself. A human error, fleeting but exact. That sound, misplaced and repeated, reminded me of the bell at vespers with the same fractional delay. I turned the thought over, not yet as evidence, but as rhythm. If one note enters early, it draws attention to time itself, the measure between action and echo. Timing is the first language of guilt. Lewis leaned close, asked if something was wrong. I told him to listen. He said it was only the choir boy missing his cue. I said there are no accidents in the pattern. He sighed and went to speak with the organist, who confirmed the practice schedule had recently been altered. The bell now rang earlier to match the hymn's closing chord. Only it hadn't. The mechanism was reliable. Someone had adjusted it manually. When the rehearsal ended, I lingered. The last note hung in the nave like incense that refused to disperse. Beneath it, almost beneath hearing, came another sound, a faint, whispering resonance from under the choir stalls. I followed it, stepping carefully between pews. The noise resolved itself into the echo of water, trapped and rhythmic, rising through the old drains from the well. It was not the first time I had mistaken sound for voice. Brother Julian found me there, bent awkwardly near the stone grating. He said softly that the well was older than the chapel, older even than the college. The monks had once believed voices of the dead traveled upward through the water, seeking forgiveness. I asked him whether he believed that. He said belief was too public a word for what he felt. As we left, I noticed a small detail, a smudge of clay on the inside of the chapel door, near the hinge. Dried, reddish, almost indistinguishable from dust. But clay in Oxford, that specific hue, came only from the garden near the Cloister well. Someone had entered the chapel that night after the rain. Someone who knew the bell could cover their sound. Later, in my flat, I found myself unable to listen to the radio. Even the faintest melody seemed to betray that same unease, notes slightly misaligned, harmonies refusing to resolve. I poured a whiskey and watched the amber catch the lamplight. In the reflection on the glass, I thought I saw movement, a distortion, like a ripple beneath water. Lewis called to ask what I made of the choir boy's mistake. I told him it wasn't a mistake at all. It was an imitation. Crane had heard the same delay, and so had his killer. I could not yet prove it, but I was beginning to understand the mathematics of deceit, how sound, once misaligned, never truly returns to time. When I finally closed my eyes, I could still hear the echo that had replaced the original, the voice beneath the choir, not louder but more certain. Some crimes are not heard until long after the last note fades. Lewis caught up with me the next morning outside Randolph, his face carrying the usual look of reluctant patience. He said Simon March had been the poet, the former protégé. Bath, of all places. I told him to bring the car around. I needed to hear a voice that hadn't been rehearsed by Oxford. The road south was wet and unwelcoming. I remember the rain tracking the hour, windscreen like an indecisive metronome, and Lewis humming something tuneless under his breath. He asked whether I believed Crane had drowned himself. I said drowning required surrender, and I'd yet to meet a scholar capable of that. March lived in a room above a shop that sold second-hand books and cheap incense. He opened the door with a caution that quickly collapsed into recognition. He knew why we'd come. He offered tea, which I refused, and silence, which I accepted. The air inside smelled faintly of damp paper and loneliness. He admitted to knowing Crane, to having admired him once. Then, without prompting, he said he had forged a recommendation letter years ago, a desperate act, he called it, and that Crane had discovered it. I told him discovery wasn't the same as exposure. He said Crane had promised discretion and kept it until a few weeks ago when a letter arrived. Unfinished, unsigned. It accused someone not him, not by name of a sin older than scholarship. March said the phrase had frightened him. I asked to see the letter. He took it from a drawer lined with rejection slips. The paper was thin, typewritten, ending mid-sentence, the ink faintly smudged by moisture. The words were measured, deliberating the rhythm of someone revising as they wrote. I read the line aloud. The truth is always delayed. It arrives when the echo forgets its origin. The phrasing stirred something in me, though I couldn't say what. Crane's writing, yes, but perhaps also his despair. I folded the paper carefully and handed it back. March said he hadn't slept since the news of Crane's death. He looked at me, eyes hollowed by guilt he hadn't earned, and asked whether I thought he was capable of murder. I told him capability was a universal opportunity. Less so. When we left, Lewis asked if I believed the man. I said belief was a matter of tone, not evidence. He said that didn't sound like police work. I told him neither did Oxford. Back in my flat, I set the letter beside Crane's crossword and began to trace the invisible line between them, the echo the word had returned, like a refrain refusing to end. I noticed the spacing in the type, a consistent delay after each comma, an extra pause. Crane's old typewriter had a faulty key. I remembered one he had repaired himself using a sliver of wire. It produced the same hesitation. The letter was genuine, but its address had been removed, torn cleanly along the fold. Someone had read it, then kept only the part that wouldn't accuse them. Lewis called to say the coroner's report had come in. The cause of death is blunt trauma before immersion. Drowning, then, was a fiction written after the fact. I asked where the blow had struck. Back of the skull. A coward's position, I said. Lewis asked whether I meant the killer or the act. I didn't answer. Later that night, unable to sleep, I opened the window and listened to the city breathe. Somewhere beyond the spires, a bell struck 10, then, again, slightly late, that same imperfection that had haunted the case from the beginning. I poured a whiskey and turned on the radio. The announcer misread a line of poetry, substituted echo for error. It was nothing, and yet it wasn't. The words sounded interchangeable in the mouth of a tired man. That was when it occurred to me the delay wasn't merely physical, not mechanical. It was intentional, a message disguised as a flaw. Someone had learned to hide guilt in rhythm, in the difference between the note and its echo, the truth and its correction. I wrote a single phrase in my notebook before closing it. Error repeated becomes a pattern. Then I turned off the light and let the silence expand, waiting for the city, or the case, to whisper back. The day after the inquest, I found Brother Julian kneeling among the wet roses. His hands were deep in the earth, turning it with the tenderness of someone handling confession rather than soil. He did not look up when I spoke his name. He said quietly that the flowers bloomed more beautifully in silence than noise bruised them. I told him silence bruises people instead. He smiled at that, though faintly, as if humor were a forgotten language. I asked whether he had seen Dr. Vale after Crane's death. He said she came to the chapel once, late, and stayed longer than prayer required. He hadn't interrupted. I asked if she spoke. He said she stood in front of the well and said nothing at all. Then he turned back to his work, letting the trowel sink into the earth like a blade into forgiveness. I walked through the cloister, still damp from morning rain. The air smelled of old stone and something faintly medicinal, lavender polish or sanctity. At the far end, Dr. Vale stood beneath the archway, bareheaded, her expression unreadable. She said she had been expecting me. I told her expectation was a dangerous habit. She said it was a curiosity. We walked together beneath the arches, our footsteps measured by the echo of the bell's uneven rhythm. She spoke of Crane, his cruelty, his intelligence, the way he turned affection into inquiry. I asked whether she loved him. She said once, perhaps, but not in the way that redeems. She stopped by the wall where ivy had grown into the shape of a cross. Some debts, she said, cannot be paid by prayer. There was something in her tone, not remorse, not fear, but weariness. I noticed the faint trace of soil beneath her nails, as if she too had been in the garden. I asked whether she tended flowers. She said she didn't, though she visited the cloister at night when she couldn't sleep. I said insomnia often visits the guilty. She asked if that was a diagnosis or an invitation. In her rooms later, the air was thick with books and rain. The same edition of Horace lay open on her desk, the same line marked Mutato nomine de te fabula narratur. I said the story, then, was hers. She asked whose it wasn't. I noticed the manuscript catalogue on the table, Confessiones, monastici listed with a penciled tick beside it. The pencil was worn almost flat, the kind one uses when afraid of making noise. I asked when she had last been in the library. She said before the rain, though her umbrella by the door was still damp. I didn't correct her. Lies, like poetry, work better unchallenged. She asked whether Crane had suffered. I said yes, but not long. Her eyes closed briefly, as though receiving communion. Then she said something unexpected, that she'd once envied his capacity for faith, even in scholarship. He believed the truth was worth the cost, she said. I believed the cost defined truth. The silence that followed was almost kind. I found myself watching her hands, the way they rested flat against the table, unadorned, calm. Then I saw a small, faint abrasion along her wrist, a mark shaped not by accident, but by restraint. I said nothing. There are moments when deduction becomes intrusion. When I left, she remained by the window, her reflection merging with the darkening glass. The bell struck somewhere above. late as always. She turned slightly toward the sound, then whispered something I couldn't catch. It might have been a prayer or a name. Outside, I met Lewis beneath the arch. He asked if she'd said anything useful. I told him everything she said was useful. It just depended on how one listened. He said she didn't strike him as dangerous. I said most dangerous people don't. That night, I returned to the chapel alone. The choir stalls were empty, the air still. I stood by the well, staring into the darkness below. My reflection trembled there, then disappeared. Somewhere beneath the surface, the water murmured faintly, as though repeating words I hadn't spoken aloud. Silence, I realized, was her language, fluent, deliberate, exact. Crane had tried to make her speak, to name the sin she'd buried. And when words failed, she'd answered in the only dialect Oxford ever truly understood secrecy perfected into ritual. When I left, the bell began again, not late this time, but early, almost eager. For a moment, I thought it was calling for her. Then I realized it was only the city, keeping time with its mistakes. I spent that evening alone with Crane's crossword, though it felt more like a séance than an investigation. The page had yellowed faintly where the whiskey glass had rested, a ring of melancholy varnish encircling gilt. I traced the pattern with a pencil, the faint graphite line catching against the small irregularities of the paper. Words, once solved, lose their tension. I preferred them incomplete. The grid was almost full, except for the diagonal running from top left to bottom, right the spine of the thing, connecting all else. I read it again. The word seemed accidental, yet perfectly inevitable. Crane had always preferred symmetry to accident. Lewis had gone home. The station had gone quiet, that hour when Oxford felt both ageless and abandoned. Outside, I could hear the slow beat of rain on the window at the same cadence as the delayed bell. It was as if the city itself were keeping rhythm with a secret it refused to confess. I remembered Crane's letter to March, that strange phrase, "The truth is always delayed." Delay again, the echo that forgets its origin. I looked at the crossword anew, at that diagonal word cutting through the center like a fissure. Each clue beside it seemed to carry a trace of self-reference. Voice repeated, echo reversed, sound misplaced. His last puzzle had been an admission written in code. I poured another whiskey, the kind that numbs more than it comforts, and turned to my notes. There, among them, a page from the library ledger, Crane's signature smeared by ink. Beneath it, faint and barely legible, another hand had traced the same motion, not copying, but shadowing. Dr. Vale's, perhaps, or someone imitating her neat precision. The echo of a signature, the crossed word of a name. It was then that something flickered, the word crossed. Not just a puzzle term, but a choice. In the crossword, when one word meets another, it must share a letter with a single point of truth connecting two different meanings. Crane's crossword did not quite obey that rule. The word revelation intersected voice at the letter E, yet the ink there was thicker, pressed twice, as though he had gone back, reconsidered and rewritten it, not because he was uncertain, but because someone else had corrected it. I turned out the light and sat in the half-dark. Sometimes truth arrives, not through sight, but through the shape of silence. The clue beside that intersection read, "What follows confession?" I whispered the answer to the empty room. Forgiveness, but the number of letters was wrong. I counted again. 9 spaces, not 10. The missing one sat beneath the crossing, the letter E, the echo, the error. The next morning, Lewis brought news that the manuscript, Confessiones Monasticae, had been found not in the library, but in the dean's private study. Returned anonymously. The dean claimed ignorance, though her explanation had the texture of well-rehearsed uncertainty. I asked who had access to her rooms. She said Dr. Vale did once when she assisted with the college's editorial archive. I walked back to St. Frid's Wides, the air heavy with the promise of another storm. The porter nodded, unwilling to meet my eye. Inside the chapel, the light fell obliquely through the windows, coloring the flagstones in half measures of gold and grey. I placed my hand against the pew where Crane had once sat and felt, absurdly, the faint vibration of the bell through the floor. At that moment, I saw the whole pattern. The altered bell, the timed echo, the forged signature, the crossed word are all acts of correction, of something delayed then rewritten. Crane had confronted her with the truth, and she had answered by redrafting it. The scholar's instinct never erase, only amend. When I left the chapel, Dr. Vale's window stood open, curtains drawn like theatre wings after the final act. The air carried the faint smell of ink and rain. I imagined her at her desk, hands folded, listening to the bell that would ring again on time or not at all. That night, back in my flat, I opened the crossword one last time. I drew a thin line through Revelation and wrote a single word above it, revision. Then I closed the book, turned out the light, and let the rain speak for her. The night I returned to St. Frid's Wides, the rain had thinned to mist that peculiar Oxford sort of weather that hides nothing but softens everything. The porter let me in without a word. He must have known why men in colleges always do, though they pretend otherwise. The cloister was empty. Each arch held its own echo, a pocket of time where the past waited, still breathing. I remember thinking how sound behaves differently there. It travels too slowly, as if reluctant to leave. That delay again, the same delay that had threaded its way through the whole affair, the late bell, the uneven choir, the echo that followed guilt like a shadow. Dr. Vale's rooms were dark, save for a thin strip of light under the door. I knocked once and entered. She sat by the desk, motionless, a glass of something untouched beside her. Her face was pale but composed. She didn't ask how I'd found her. I told her I hadn't found me, as they all do. I said Crane's crossword had given me what his words could not, that the missing manuscript, the forged signature, even the altered bell had led me here. She said softly that he had always loved puzzles. I replied that this one had cost him more than most. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain ticked against the window like hesitant applause. Then she said she had met Crane in the chapel that night, not for confession, but for correction. He had discovered her affair with March, yes, but more than that. He had learned of the plagiarism that underpinned her reputation. He'd meant to expose her at the next faculty meeting. She had begged him for silence. I could almost hear it, the two of them standing beneath that broken bell, her voice trembling, his unyieldingness. A scholar's cruelty is always precise. When he threatened to ruin her, she must have pushed him one movement, one reflex, the kind that comes from fear rather than rage. He'd fallen against the stones, struck his head, slipped into the well. I told her so, not accusingly, but as a man stating what both already knew. She turned her face toward the window. She said she hadn't meant to kill him, only to silence him. Silence, she repeated, as though tasting the word for its iron aftertaste. I said silence seldom obeys its masters. She asked if I would arrest her. I said perhaps later. For now, I only wanted to understand why she'd altered the bell. She looked at me then, the faintest trace of something like relief passing through her eyes. Because, she said, time had betrayed her once, and she wished to control it, if only for a moment. I asked what she heard when the bell rang now. She said nothing at all. I believed her. When I left, she was still sitting there, framed by the pale lamplight, her hands folded in her lap as though awaiting judgment from a god who no longer marked attendance. Outside, the cloister glistened. Water ran down the stone faces of saints, long resigned to human folly. The bell hung above me, silent for once, though I fancied I could still feel its weight in the air. Lewis met me at the gate. He asked if it was finished. I told him things like this are never finished, only paused until the next echo. He said she'd confessed then. I said not quite. She'd only stopped lying. On the way back, the city lay hushed, the lamps reflecting in shallow pools like punctuation marks in a sentence that refused to end. I thought of Crane, of his crossword, of the way he'd chosen words not for truth but for precision. He would have understood her. Perhaps he already had. At my flat, I poured a whiskey and stood by the window. The night stretched itself thin across the rooftops. Somewhere far off, a bell began to ring again, faint and delayed. It came not as an accusation, but as a whisper, the kind Oxford keeps for those who listen too long. I closed the curtains, finished the drink, and let the sound fade. It did not end so much as dissolve, like a word crossed out yet still legible beneath the ink. After the statement was taken, after the signatures were made and the silence pressed itself back into the cracks of the city, I walked once more through the quadrangle of St. Fridis Wides. The rain had ceased, but left behind that ghostly shimmer that Oxford wears better than any other city. The college windows glowed faintly with lamplight behind them, the small movements of a life resuming its pattern. Lectures to be written, letters to be ignored, sins to be catalogued discreetly for another day. Lewis had gone ahead to the car, though I doubted he would start it until I appeared. He has that rare loyalty which demands no understanding. I paused at the cloister arch, where the air smelled faintly of incense and moss. A cleaner's bucket leaned against the stone, half filled with the rain. The bell above the chapel gave a small, uncertain stir, as if testing its voice after illness. It would ring on time now, they told me. The mechanism had been corrected, yet when it finally struck, it seemed to hesitate still a fraction late, as though reluctant to part from the delay that had defined it. Perhaps some imperfections cannot be repaired, only remembered. In the chapel, the choir rehearsed for Sunday. The notes rose faintly through the half-opened doors, minor chords trembling against the wet glass. I recognized the piece Agnus Dei in C minor. There is always something unfinished in that key. It aches toward resolution and never arrives. I stood listening, half in the doorway, half in the shadow. The music seemed to move through the air like memories, familiar, wounded, incomplete. I thought of Crane, and of the crossword I still kept folded in my coat, of the faint diagonal word revelation overwritten at its heart. He had been a man too fond of symmetry, and death, I think, found him for that. Vale would face her trial soon enough. Whether she would endure it, I did not know. I had seen too many people mistake punishment for redemption. When I visited her that morning in custody, she had been calm. She asked if the bell still rang late. I told her it did, just enough to be human. She nodded, as though she understood. She said she had dreamt of Crane standing beside the well, asking her to correct a translation. I said nothing. Some dreams are confessions that no judge could hear. I left her then, as the warder closed the door. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Every echo in this case seemed reluctant to die. Lewis met me by the car, engine idling, his face drawn. He said it was a pity, all that cleverness wasted. I told him cleverness is only useful to those who can live with it. He asked whether I believed her story that she hadn't meant to kill him. I said intention rarely survives collision with consequence. On the drive back, Oxford spread itself beneath a bruised sky. The rain returned, soft and without conviction. I watched it trace paths down the windscreen, each line crossing another, forming small symmetrical prisons of water and light. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I said that every puzzle, once solved, leaves an aftertaste. He said I should rest. I said I would try. Back in my flat, The night was quiet except for the low hum of traffic somewhere beyond the colleges. I poured a measure of whiskey, the last of the bottle. It caught the lamplight like amber glass. On the gramophone, I placed a recording of Mozart's Requiem, the final movement, slow, unresolved. The same key, C minor, always the same. As the music played, I unfolded the crossword one final time. My pencil hesitated over the last clue. What follows confession? I'd written forgiveness before, uncertain of it. Now I crossed it out and wrote in silence. It fit too neatly to be right, yet it felt true. The choir on the record reached Kyrie, the pleading repetition fading into the quiet. Outside, the bells of St. Fridswide's began again, measured, deliberate, and for once precisely on time. I set down the pencil, turned off the lamp, and listened until the last note dissolved into nothing. If peace exists, I thought, it must sound like that one imperfection corrected, another left to echo.